King Charles has named his youngest brother, Prince Edward, the Duke of Edinburgh, a title held, of course, by his late father, Prince Philip, for more than 70 years. It had been the late Prince's wish for Prince Edward to be granted the dukedom.
Prince William has just stunned the entire United Kingdom by quietly signing the single document Buckingham Palace insiders swore he would never touch, shattering decades of unspoken royal protocol, and finally breaking the invisible seal his late grandmother pressed upon the House of Windsor. In one calculated stroke of his fountain pen, the future king has elevated the children of Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, into positions no palace strategist ever dared predict, rewriting the succession's most delicate architecture on the very week his aunt by marriage turned 60. For 26 long years, Sophie has stood in the shadowed corridors of the institution as its most silent guardian, its most disciplined loyalist, its quietest protector of a crown that once tried to break her. She had taken a solemn vow at Windsor in the biting winter of 1999 never to seek elevation for her bloodline, never to push her children into the gilded machinery that had devoured so many before them, never to break the sacred protocol laid down by Queen Elizabeth herself. And yet something catastrophic behind palace walls has finally forced William's hand, something so devastating, so calculated, so ruthlessly hidden by the men in grey, that the young king-in-waiting had no choice but to obliterate the old rules and rebuild the monarchy in a single afternoon. What exactly did Queen Elizabeth predict about Sophie's bloodline in a letter sealed away at Sandringham for nearly 2 decades? Why did the late monarch explicitly forbid any elevation of the Wessex children during her lifetime, only to reverse that decree in her final months? And what dark hidden tragedy inside the corridors of Buckingham Palace finally compelled Prince William to act now, at this exact moment, when the institution itself teeters on the edge of generational collapse? The library at Bagshot Park sat cavernous and hauntingly quiet in the pale frost-covered light of a January morning, its mullioned windows fogged at the edges from the biting cold that had settled over Surrey overnight. Dust motes danced lazily in the thin ribbons of sunlight that spilled across the Persian rugs, catching on the mahogany bookshelves that lined the room from floor to gilded ceiling. A grandfather clock ticked with metronomic patience near the far wall, its brass pendulum swinging beneath a Van Dyck portrait that had hung in the Edinburgh family's private residence since Sophie and Edward first took possession of the estate. On the great desk at the room's center, positioned with almost surgical precision atop a green leather blotter, sat a cream-colored envelope bearing the unmistakable crest of the late Queen Elizabeth II. The wax seal, deep crimson and slightly cracked with age, still held firm after 22 years of secret custody, its imprint showing the small, delicate figure of a swallow in flight, a private motif the late monarch had used only for her most sacred and personal correspondences. Beside it lay a second object, smaller, colder, more sinister in its implications, a tarnished brass key, its bow shaped into the intertwined initials E and S, its shaft worn smooth by decades of quiet handling. Sophie's fingers, pale and trembling in the winter light, hovered above both objects as if she were afraid the very act of touching them might summon the storm she had spent her entire adult life preventing. For a long moment, she said nothing at all. Then, in a voice growly and weighted with the sedimented pain of 2 decades of institutional silence, she addressed the small camera positioned discreetly on the edge of the desk. For 26 years, she said, her breath visible in the cold library air, the world has spoken for her. Today, I am speaking for her. The date she referenced was August 1997, a date every British citizen over the age of 30 could still name without hesitation, though the meaning she attached to it would not become clear for many minutes yet. Behind the camera, positioned just outside its frame, stood a woman named Margaret Ellingsworth, the family's private archivist and the sole other soul entrusted with the contents of the sealed envelope. Margaret's hands trembled visibly against the clipboard she clutched, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared along her hairline despite the chill of the room. In her earpiece, a producer's voice was already crackling with urgency. Encrypted feeds from a small independent broadcaster were being routed through 3 separate satellite uplinks in an attempt to stay ahead of what everyone in that room understood was coming. A coordinated palace effort to sever the transmission the moment its true content became clear. They were cornered. The trap had been set decades ago, and only now in this cold January morning was Sophie preparing to spring it in reverse. The story, as she began to tell it, reached back much further than the world understood. In the autumn of 1993, 4 years before the tragedy that would fracture the House of Windsor forever, a young Sophie Rhys-Jones had been introduced to Diana, Princess of Wales, at a small private luncheon held at Kensington Palace. The scent of white gardenias had filled the drawing room that afternoon, arranged in tall crystal vases along the mantel, and the rhythmic click of Diana's Oxford heels against the parquet floor still lingered in Sophie's memory with the vividness of a dream one cannot shake. Diana had taken her aside near the tall windows overlooking the gardens, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she had said something Sophie would carry with her for the rest of her life. They will come for you too one day. Not now, not in the obvious ways. But when the boys are grown, and the old queen is gone, they will look at your children the way they once looked at mine. Promise me, Sophie, promise me you will hide them until the storm has passed. The chime of a distant grandfather clock had punctuated the moment, and Diana had squeezed her hand with a strength that seemed almost desperate. It had been a prophecy, though Sophie had not understood it as such at the time. She had simply nodded, murmured her assent, and filed the strange encounter away in the quiet vault of her memory. 4 years later, in the suffocating heat of that terrible August, everything Diana had warned her about seemed to detonate at once. But it was not Diana's death alone that had reshaped Sophie's silent oath. It was what came after. In the biting cold December of 1999, weeks before her marriage to Prince Edward, Sophie had been summoned to a private audience with Queen Elizabeth II at Sandringham. The monarch had received her in the small yellow drawing room, seated in a wingback chair beside a crackling fire, a single cup of Earl Grey steaming on the table beside her. The late Queen's eyes, sharp as flint even in her 70s, had studied Sophie for a long moment before she spoke. Your children, she had said without preamble, will not carry the titles their birthright would ordinarily afford them. Not while I live, not while the boys are still finding their way. Do you understand why? Sophie had nodded, though she had not fully understood. There are men within these walls, the Queen had continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that Sophie had to lean forward to catch, who will use any elevation, any prominence, any titled child as a weapon against William and Harry. I will not have your babies turned into instruments of an internal war. Swear to me you will not seek elevation for them. Swear it on the swallow. And Sophie had sworn, though she had not known then what the swallow meant or why the old Queen's hand had trembled as she pressed a small brass key into her palm. The scene shifted, and outside the library windows the January light seemed to darken, though the clock read only 10:30. Sophie's voice, when she resumed, was steadier now, carrying the weight of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind for more than 2 decades. The men in grey. She had come to know them intimately over the years, though she had never learned all their names. They wore charcoal suits cut to institutional precision, polished Oxford shoes that clicked with predatory rhythm against palace floors, and their eyes, when they met yours, held the cold indifference of a mechanism rather than a soul. They carried clipboards and encrypted phones, moved through Buckingham Palace's back corridors like blood through arteries, and had operated for nearly half a century as the true invisible architects of every royal crisis the public had ever witnessed. It was they, Sophie now understood, who had orchestrated the isolation of Diana in the years before her death. It was they who had whispered against her, briefed against her, engineered the slow-burn campaign of institutional cruelty that had driven the Princess of Wales to the edge of her sanity. And it was one man in particular, a senior courtier, whose fingerprints Sophie could now trace across every major palace tragedy of the past 40 years, who had authored the deepest wounds. He was still there, still walking those corridors, still operating with impunity within the very heart of the institution William was about to inherit. She would not name him aloud, not yet. But the letter she was about to open would. Across the country, in pubs from Edinburgh to Plymouth, in living rooms from Belfast to Brighton, something was beginning to ripple through the national consciousness. 20 million people were watching live, or would be within the hour, as encrypted feeds spilled out across independent broadcasters and streaming platforms that the palace had not yet managed to suppress. In a pub off the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, a pint glass froze halfway to a man's lips as the crawler beneath the screen announced that the Duchess of Edinburgh was preparing to make an unprecedented public statement. In a kitchen in Cardiff, a mother turned the volume up while her tea grew cold. In a boardroom in the City of London, 3 senior executives fell silent mid-meeting as their phones lit up simultaneously with the same push notification. The nation held its breath. Millions of screens flickered in synchronized anticipation, and in the library at Bagshot Park, Sophie reached at last for the crimson wax seal. The crack of the seal breaking was surprisingly loud in the quiet room, a small, sharp report like the snap of a dry twig underfoot in a winter wood. Margaret Ellingsworth flinched visibly. The producer's voice in her earpiece had gone silent, whether from awe or from the palace's first successful interference she could not yet tell. Sophie unfolded the letter with fingers that had steadied themselves through sheer force of aristocratic composure, and the cream-colored paper crackled softly as it opened to reveal the late Queen's unmistakable hand. A spidery, elegant script that had signed every important document of the Elizabethan era. The letter was dated the 14th February 2022, 7 months before the Queen's death at Balmoral. It began without salutation, without ceremony, in the direct and unflinching manner Elizabeth had reserved for matters she considered too important for the ordinary courtesies. My dear Sophie, it read, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the promise I extracted from you at Sandringham in 1999 is now released. What I asked of you then, I now beg you to reverse. The men I feared have not been dismantled in the years since I first warned you of them. They have grown stronger, more entrenched, more ruthless in the wake of my son's ascension. William will need your children, not as reserves, not as ornaments, but as a bulwark against the very machinery that destroyed Diana, that fractured William from Harry, that turned my own house against itself. James must be elevated. Louise must be given her rightful station. The Edinburgh line must be raised so that when William takes the throne, he does not stand alone against them. Sophie's voice cracked as she read the next passage aloud, and a single tear traced its way down her cheek, glinting in the pale winter light. You will know the hour has come, the Queen had written, when the man I could never name aloud makes his move against William. He will do it quietly, in the way he does all things, through a briefing, through a whisper, through a document that appears to bear my authority but does not. When that day comes, Sophie, you must break the seal, open the second compartment, and give William the swallow. He will understand. He has always understood, even when he pretended not to. The mechanical click of the brass key turning in a hidden compartment beneath the desk was almost inaudible, but every soul in that library heard it as though it had been a cathedral bell. From within the false-bottom drawer, Sophie withdrew a second object, wrapped in oiled silk, its shape unmistakable to anyone who had studied the private iconography of the late Queen. A small silver swallow, wings outstretched in flight, its underside engraved with a cipher that MI6 forensic experts would later confirm matched the Queen's personal cryptographic signature with mathematical precision. The swallow was more than a symbol, it was a failsafe, a key, a summons. And in the deepest chambers of the palace machinery, a small number of very old men understood exactly what its emergence into public light would mean. He was terrified. Somewhere in a wood-paneled office in Buckingham Palace, the senior courtier the Queen had refused to name aloud watched a monitor with the color draining from his face, his knuckles white against the arm of his chair, his breath hitched in his throat like a man who has just seen his own name written on a tombstone. The antique rotary phone on the corner of the library desk began to ring. Sophie stared at it for a long moment before answering. The instrument had been installed by the Queen herself in 2001, connected to a single private line that terminated in only 3 other places in the world: Kensington Palace, Frogmore Cottage, and Balmoral. Its ring, unheard in over a decade, was a low mechanical burr that seemed to shake the very air of the room. When she lifted the receiver at last, the voice on the other end was one she had known since the boy on the line was a small child running through the gardens of Highgrove. Aunt Sophie. William's voice was stripped of sovereign authority, stripped of the practiced calm of a future king, reduced to something raw and fractured, the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy walking behind his mother's coffin. Tell me it's real. Tell me she wrote it. The swallow is real. It's real, darling, Sophie whispered, her own voice cracking. It's all real. She left it for you. She always meant it for you. There was a long silence on the line, broken only by what sounded unmistakably like the future King of England weeping into a telephone receiver in a private study at Windsor. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier, colder, harder than Sophie had ever heard it. I've signed the papers, Aunt Sophie. James is Earl of Wessex from this morning. Louise will have her rightful designation confirmed by the end of the week. And the man, Aunt Sophie, the man she couldn't name. I know who he is. I've always known. He's finished. Do you understand me? He is finished. The line went dead. Sophie set the receiver down with hands that had at last stopped trembling. Outside the mullioned windows, a small flock of birds rose suddenly from the beech trees at the edge of the park, wheeling upward into the winter sky in a formation that, to anyone watching closely, might have resembled the shape of a single swallow taking flight. But the story was not yet finished. There was still the matter of the second flashback, the buried memory Sophie had carried alone for 22 years, the moment that had transformed her from a peripheral member of the royal family into its most silent and most disciplined guardian. It had happened in September 1997, 3 weeks after Diana's funeral, in a small drawing room at Balmoral where the Queen had received her privately for a second, unrecorded audience. The scent of heather had drifted through the open windows, and the distant sound of pipers rehearsing in the courtyard had filled the pauses in the conversation. Elizabeth, dressed in black, her face drawn with a grief the world had never been permitted to see, had taken Sophie's hands in her own and had spoken words Sophie had never repeated to another living soul until this morning. They killed her, Sophie, not with their hands, not with the tunnel, but with everything that came before. And they will come for the boys next unless we build a wall around them that they cannot breach. You are part of that wall. Edward is part of that wall. Your children, when they come, will be part of that wall. Do you understand? And Sophie had understood, though the weight of that understanding had nearly crushed her. For 26 years she had been the wall, silent, disciplined, unelevated, invisible to the public eye. She had raised James and Louise deliberately outside the machinery of royal expectation, sending them to ordinary schools, allowing them to work ordinary jobs, refusing every offer of elevation the palace had half-heartedly extended over the years. She had endured tabloid dismissals of her as the boring royal, the invisible duchess, the forgotten-in-law, and she had smiled through every one of them, because the Queen had asked her to be forgotten, because being forgotten was the only way to protect her children from the men in gray. And now at last the wall was rising into view, and the men on the other side of it were beginning to understand what had been built while they were not looking. Across London, in a small flat in Notting Hill, a retired journalist named Colin Faraday sat frozen in front of his television, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hand. Faraday had spent 30 years covering the royal family, and he had known, in the private way that veteran journalists sometimes know things they can never print, that there was a rot at the heart of Buckingham Palace that had never been properly named. He had known it since the summer of 1997, when a source inside the palace communications office had whispered to him, at a bar off Fleet Street, that Diana's fate had been sealed months before the tunnel in Paris, sealed in a series of internal memos authored by a single senior courtier whose name Faraday had never dared publish. He had known it in 2019, when the same source, now dying of cancer in a hospice in Kent, had called him one last time to whisper that same name into his ear. And now, watching the Duchess of Edinburgh sit in a library at Bagshot Park with the silver swallow gleaming in her hand, Faraday understood at last that the name was about to be spoken aloud. He was not wrong. Sophie lifted the swallow, turned it slowly in the pale winter light, and read the cipher engraved on its underside. It was a name. Not a full name, but a role, a designation, a title that only a small number of people in the world would recognize immediately. The principal private secretary to the sovereign in the years 1996 through 2005, she read, her voice steady now, almost surgical in its calm. The architect of the campaign against the Princess of Wales. The author of the memoranda that stripped her of her security detail in the summer of 1997. The man who briefed against Prince Harry for a decade. The man who has continued to operate inside these walls, under successive reigns, under successive titles, under successive layers of institutional protection. He is still there. He is watching this broadcast, and he knows at last that his name is now written on the record. She did not speak the name aloud. She did not have to. Within the hour, every royal correspondent in the United Kingdom would have identified him from the cipher's specifications, and by the end of the day, his resignation would have been announced by the palace in a 2-sentence statement that mentioned neither the swallow nor the letter nor the Duchess of Edinburgh at all. But the truth would be out, and the truth at last would have saved her boys. In a private study at Windsor, William set down the receiver of an encrypted satellite phone and closed his eyes. On the desk before him lay a stack of documents his private secretary had presented that morning, elevation papers, letters patent, formal decrees restructuring the working royal family in a manner not seen since the reign of George V. He had signed each of them, one after another, with the same fountain pen his grandmother had used to sign her own accession documents in 1952. James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten Windsor, Earl of Wessex. Lady Louise Windsor, confirmed in her titles and elevated to a position of quiet prominence within the new working royal household. The Edinburgh line, once relegated to the margins, now positioned as the beating heart of the modern monarchy's future. Catherine, watching him from the doorway, had said nothing for a long moment. Then softly, "It's what she wanted, isn't it? Your grandmother? It's what my mother wanted," William had answered, his voice barely above a whisper. My grandmother only understood it at the end. Outside the windows of the Windsor study, the same small flock of birds that had risen from the beech trees at Bagshot Park could be seen, or could be imagined to be seen, wheeling in the winter sky above the long walk, their formation unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. The second phone call came an hour later, this time to Sophie's private mobile, and this time the voice on the other end was one she had not heard in nearly 4 years. Harry, calling from Montecito, his voice thick with something that might have been grief, or might have been vindication, or might have been both at once. Aunt Sophie. A long pause, in which she could hear the distant sound of children playing in a California garden. "Is it true? All of it?" "All of it, darling," she said again, as she had said to William. "Every word." She was right, then. Harry's voice cracked. "My mother. She was right about all of it." "She was right about all of it," Sophie confirmed. "And your brother knows now. He has always known, but now he has the proof. The man is finished, Harry. The machinery that did this to her, to you, to William, it is being dismantled as we speak." There was a long silence on the line. Then quietly, "I'm coming home, Aunt Sophie. Tell William I'm coming home." She set the phone down with a hand that had at last gone completely still. In the corridors of Buckingham Palace, silence had descended with the weight of a mausoleum. Doors were being locked. Sensitive files were being sealed. Senior courtiers were making phone calls that would never appear on any official record. And in a wood-paneled office on the second floor, a man in a charcoal suit sat alone with his hands trembling above a keyboard, understanding at last that 40 years of invisible architecture were about to collapse around him in the space of a single afternoon. The palace's official statement, when it came, was 2 sentences long. It confirmed the elevation of James, Earl of Wessex, and the formal recognition of Lady Louise Windsor's titles. It made no mention of the letter, no mention of the swallow, no mention of the Duchess of Edinburgh's extraordinary broadcast from the library at Bagshot Park. The palace's silence on the deeper matter was, in its own way, the loudest confirmation the nation had ever received. When Buckingham Palace declined to comment, when Buckingham Palace refused to acknowledge, when Buckingham Palace retreated behind the ancient shield of no comment, the British public had learned over the course of half a century that the truth was invariably worse than anything the palace was willing to deny. 20 million people had watched the broadcast. By the end of the week, that number would rise to over 80 million globally, and the cipher on the underside of the swallow would be decoded and identified by 3 separate independent journalists working from 3 separate countries. The senior courtier whose name had never been spoken aloud would resign quietly within 72 hours, citing personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family, and would retreat to a small estate in the Scottish borders where he would live out the remainder of his days in a silence far more suffocating than any prison. But the deeper story, the one that would be told and retold in the years to come, was not about the man's fall. It was about the woman who had made it possible. Sophie sat for a long time in the quiet library at Bagshot Park after the broadcast ended. The camera had been switched off. Margaret Ellingsworth had gathered the documents and retreated to a smaller adjacent room to begin the careful process of archiving everything that had just occurred. The winter light was fading now, the first hint of evening beginning to gather at the edges of the sky, and the grandfather clock in the corner continued its patient metronomic ticking as it had done for nearly 2 centuries. She thought of Diana, standing at the tall windows of Kensington Palace in the autumn of 1993, whispering a prophecy that had taken 32 years to reach its fulfillment. She thought of the late Queen, taking her hands at Balmoral in the September of 1997, asking her to become a wall around 2 grieving boys. She thought of her own children, James and Louise, who had grown up in the deliberate obscurity she had constructed for them, and who now, at last, could step into the light without fear of what waited for them there. She lifted the silver swallow one last time, turned it slowly in her palm, and pressed it gently to her lips. Then she wrapped it in the oiled silk and placed it in the false-bottom drawer beneath the desk, where it would remain until the day William, as king, chose to enshrine it among the crown's most sacred artifacts at St. George's Chapel, alongside the private effects of the grandmother who had entrusted it to Sophie's keeping so many years before. A single tear traced its way down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "You can rest now," she whispered to a woman who had been dead for 26 years. "You can rest at last." Outside the mullioned windows, the winter sky was deepening toward twilight, and somewhere in the beech trees at the edge of the park, a small bird was singing a song that seemed, to anyone listening closely, almost impossibly like the notes of a lullaby a young mother had once hummed to 2 small boys in a garden at Highgrove, in a summer that felt, now, as though it had happened in another century. The broadcast had cut to black nearly an hour ago. No music had played over the fade. No commentary had followed. No presenter had appeared to summarize what the nation had just witnessed. The screens had simply gone dark, and had remained dark for the better part of 90 seconds, and then had returned to ordinary programming as though nothing at all had happened. But something had happened, something enormous, something that would be written about, argued over, and reinterpreted for the next 50 years. The monarchy had, in the space of a single winter morning, been quietly and irrevocably transformed. The men in grey had been broken. The Edinburgh line had been raised. The swallow had at last flown free. And in living rooms across the United Kingdom, in pubs from Edinburgh to Plymouth, in kitchens from Belfast to Brighton, an entire nation sat in stunned and reverent silence, understanding without needing to be told that they had just witnessed the closing of a wound that had been open since the summer of 1997. The truth had saved her boys. The swallow had finally flown free. The secret was out.